When my grandson appeared at my door with a look that didn't belong on someone his age, I knew the evening would change both of us. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic, but quiet, heavy, and unforgettable. The kind of moment that reshapes how you see family, trust, and yourself. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I still remember the sound of the knock. It wasn't urgent, not rushed, just soft enough to make me pause before answering. The late afternoon light was stretching across my living room, dust floating lazily like it always did this time of day. I had been folding laundry, the radio murmuring some old song I half knew, when that knock landed heavier than it should have. When I had opened the door, there he was, my grandson. Taller than the last time I'd seen him, shoulders slumped in a way that didn't match his frame. His eyes met mine for only a second before dropping to the porch boards. That's when I knew something was wrong. Not the scraped knee kind of wrong. Not the forgot my wallet kind. This was deeper, the kind you feel before it's spoken. I stepped aside without a word. He came in, bringing with him the cool air and a silence that felt crowded. The house smelled like clean cotton and brewed coffee, familiar and safe, and I hoped it might steady him. He stood near the doorway, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, like he didn't know where to put himself. "You hungry?" I asked, because sometimes the easiest question opens the hardest doors. He shook his head. Not really. I nodded and went back to the kitchen anyway, giving him space without leaving him alone. The kettle clicked on, and I leaned against the counter, listening to his uneven breathing from the other room. I've lived long enough to know that pain doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, hoping someone will notice. When he finally spoke, his voice surprised me. It sounded older, worn around the edges. "Grandma, can I stay here for a bit?" That word "bit" carried so much weight it nearly bent the room. I told him he could stay as long as he needed, and I meant it with every year behind me. He sat at the table while I poured the water, steam rising between us like a curtain. For a moment, we just listened to it hiss and settle. He didn't tell me everything right away. He talked around it, about school, about work, about how things just felt off. I didn't push. I remembered being his age, how hard it was to admit you were lost, especially to someone who'd watched you grow. Instead, I told him about the first time I realized adulthood didn't come with answers, only choices. His eyes lifted then, meeting mine, and I saw relief flicker there. Outside, a car passed, tires humming on pavement. Inside, time slowed. He asked if I ever regretted the roads I didn't take. I laughed softly and told him regret was a poor companion, but reflection could be a good teacher. He listened, really listened, and I realized this wasn't just about him needing shelter. It was about connection, about finding solid ground in someone who wasn't trying to fix him. As evening crept closer, the shadows grew longer, and the tension he carried seemed to ease just a little. Not gone, but lighter, like a coat set down for the moment. I watched him carefully, feeling the quiet responsibility of being someone's safe place. I didn't know then how much that night would change me too, how it would remind me that even later in life, we're still discovering what it means to show up for each other. The evening settled in gently, the way it used to when my children were small, and the day finally let go of us. I turned on a lamp in the living room, the soft yellow light warming the corners, making everything feel less sharp. He sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at a spot on the rug like it held answers he hadn't found yet. I brought 2 mugs of tea and handed him one. Our fingers barely touched, but he flinched anyway, then gave an apologetic half-smile. That told me more than words could. He was carrying something heavy, something that had been pressing on him for longer than today. We sat there quietly for a while. I've learned over the years that silence can be a gift if you don't rush to fill it. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and patient. Outside, the sky deepened into that deep blue that always makes me reflective. Finally, he took a breath that sounded like it had been waiting all day to come out. "I don't feel like myself anymore," he said. "And I don't know when that started." I nodded slowly. "That happens to more people than you think," I told him. "Sometimes it's not about losing yourself. Sometimes it's about growing into someone unfamiliar." He looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing me not just as his grandmother, but as a woman who had lived through storms of her own. I shared a little of my past, careful not to turn it into a lecture. I told him about a time when I felt cornered by expectations, when every choice felt like a mistake waiting to happen. I didn't give him solutions. I gave him honesty. He relaxed back into the couch, shoulders dropping for the first time since he arrived. "I didn't think anyone would understand," he said quietly. "I understand more than you know," I replied, and I did. Not his exact situation, but the weight of confusion, the fear of disappointing others, the loneliness of feeling out of step with the world. Those feelings don't disappear with age. You just learn how to sit with them. Later, we ate a simple dinner together. Nothing fancy, just food made with care. The clink of utensils, the normalcy of it all, seemed to ground him. He even laughed once, a short sound, surprised, like it slipped out without permission. That sound stayed with me. Afterward, he helped clear the table without being asked. Another small sign that he was starting to feel human again. We talked about ordinary things then. A show he liked. A memory from when he was little that I'd almost forgotten. Each shared moment stitched something back together, slowly and gently. When night finally wrapped around the house, he stood and asked where he should sleep. I showed him the spare room, the one with the old quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. He paused in the doorway, turning back to me. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But it carried everything he couldn't say yet. I watched him close the door, then stood alone in the hallway, listening to the house breathe. I realized then that this wasn't just about helping him through a hard moment. It was about trust, about being present when someone chooses to be vulnerable with you. And as I turned off the lights, I felt a quiet sense of purpose settle in, knowing tomorrow would bring more truth, whether we were ready for it or not. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried he'd leave, but because my mind kept circling the way his eyes had looked when he first stepped inside. That look doesn't belong to one age or one generation. It belongs to anyone who's carrying more than they know how to set down. Morning came slowly. Pale light slipped through the curtains, and the house creaked the way it always does when it wakes up. I made breakfast out of habit, the familiar motions calming me. Eggs, toast, coffee strong enough to announce itself. When he finally came into the kitchen, his hair was still rumpled from sleep, but there was a softness to his face I hadn't seen the day before. He sat at the table, wrapped his hands around the mug I set in front of him, and stared into it like it might talk back. "I didn't realize how tired I was," he said. "That happens when you finally stop holding your breath," I answered. He smiled faintly. We ate quietly, but it wasn't the heavy silence from before. This one felt earned. After a while, he began to talk again, this time more directly. About pressure. About feeling like he was failing even when he was doing everything expected of him. About not knowing who he was supposed to be when all the noise fell away. I listened, not to fix, not to judge, just to hear him. I told him it was okay to pause, that life doesn't always move in straight lines, no matter how much people pretend it does. I reminded him that worth isn't measured by speed or achievement, Those words weren't rehearsed. They came from places I'd learned the hard way. At one point, he asked me how I'd known when to keep going and when to change direction. I laughed softly and told him I rarely knew at the time. "Clarity usually shows up later," I said. "In the meantime, you do your best and stay kind to yourself." We took a walk later that morning. The neighborhood was quiet, leaves crunching underfoot, the air cool and honest. He walked beside me, matching my pace without thinking about it. Every so often, he'd point something out, a memory tied to a house or a tree. It struck me how much of his life I'd witnessed from a distance, and how rarely we stood side by side like this. Halfway down the block, he stopped and turned to me. "I'm glad I came here," he said. "I didn't know where else to go." I reached out and squeezed his hand, brief and steady. "You came because you knew you'd be safe," I told him. "That matters." As we walked back, I felt something shift inside me too. A reminder that even now, even after years of thinking my role was mostly behind me, I still had something important to offer. Not answers, presence, perspective, care. That afternoon, he made a phone call he'd been avoiding. I didn't listen in, but I heard the steadiness in his voice when he was done. He looked lighter afterward, like someone who'd taken a difficult step and survived it. By the time the sun began to dip again, the house felt different. Not quieter, but fuller. I knew he still had a long road ahead, but I also knew this moment would stay with both of us. A turning point, not because everything was solved, but because something essential had been seen, spoken, and respected. The last evening came quieter than I expected. He had spent most of the afternoon packing his things, not because I asked him to leave, but because he said he felt ready to face what he'd been avoiding. There was a steadiness in his movements now, not rushed, not heavy, just deliberate. That alone told me something important had changed. We sat together one final time at the kitchen table as dusk settled in. The window reflected us back to ourselves,